Yeah. So good afternoon, everyone. So my name is R. Pradeep Kumar, and I am Vice President South of IS30 Indian Association of Structural Engineers, and I'm very happy to announce this monthly lecture series on various topics of structural engineering. So the idea is to bring experts who have worked in this area in different areas of structural engineering and present their expertise, and we all listen to them and learn from them. So this will be monthly lecture series, which is jointly organized in association with IIIT, that is IS30 and IIIT Hyderabad joint lecture series. So first, I thank Professor Arun Menon to start this lecture series with his lecture on challenges in seismic risk assessment and retrofit in historical and heritage structures. So before we go into the lecture, I request Shri Manoj Mittal sir, who is president of Indian Association of Structural Engineers, to give presidential remarks. Sir, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Pradeep. Really, it is my pleasure to welcome Professor Arun Menon and all the participants in this webinar. I'm extremely happy that Southern region of IS30, headed by Professor R. Pradeep Kumar, has taken this initiative to start monthly lectures. I'm quite confident such expert lectures will enhance our understanding of the subject and will also bring qualitative improvement in the structural engineering practice. This is the first webinar in this series. The topic challenges in seismic risk assessment and retrofit in historical and heritage structures is very interesting and appropriate. It requires understanding of not only the structural engineering aspects, but also the material, aesthetics, and other considerations. Usual retrofit techniques may not be suitable in such structures, so we need to improvise in such situations. I'm sure it will be quite learning experience for all of us. I will also take this opportunity to say a few words about IS30. As many of you know, Indian Association of Structural Engineers is a national level apex body of structural engineers in India. It has presence all over India. Its governing council consists of leading structural engineers of India. Apart from conducting regular quality technical lectures, webinars, conferences, refresher courses, it is engaged in publishing code commentaries, guidelines, and also it also publishes a technical journal, SED, that is Structural Engineering Digest. And incidentally, Dr. Pradeep Kumar is the chief editor of that also. We also represent in various technical committees of BIS and Indian Road Congress. IS30 also interact with government bodies on matters, policy matters pertaining to the structural engineering. And you will be happy to know that IS30 is starting a refresher course on structural rehabilitation and retrofitting. And this course will start on 4th of September, and it will continue till 2nd of October. Classes will be conducted on each Saturday. So registration is already on, and anybody who is interested can join it. I will also encourage participants to join IS30 as members. And I again, once again, welcome Dr. Arun Kumar, Dr. Arun Menon, this webinar, and I am looking forward to hear his presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir, for your presidential remarks. Now we'll move to Professor Arun Menon's lecture. So just I'll take a few minutes to introduce Professor Arun Menon, even though he is known to many people who are attending here. And actually, I have known Arun Menon from the time he joined IIT Madras, but I never got chance to go through his CV or biodata in detail. But when I got this opportunity of introducing him to the audience, I went through his biodata, and I am really extremely happy to see his illustrious career. And he has a background in architecture as well as engineering. His first degree is in BR, that is Bachelor of Architecture, and from NIT Tiruchirappalli, and master's degree from IIT Madras, and he has another master and PhD from Rose School, that is University of Pavia, Italy, in specialization earthquake engineering. His main area of research is this heritage structures. So structural safety of historical monuments, seismic behavior assessment, retrofitting. So that is his core area. Risk assessment. So he has got several awards, and is a Young Faculty Recognition Award from IIT Madras itself, and a Best Outgoing Student from his NIT, and then like Architect Karchi Endowment Award for Best Architecture Thesis. And he has been involved in several prestigious restoration and rehabilitation projects for mainly giving the expert input and also hand-holding the retrofitting process. So he traveled to many countries on this job. So we are eager to hear directly from Arun Menon on this topic. So Arun, over to you.
Okay. Very good evening to everybody. At the outset, I would like to thank IAS Shakti, President Shri Manoj Mittal, and Vice President Pradeep Ramcharla, Professor at IIIT Hyderabad, for this invite and for the opportunity to speak to the South Indian chapter of IAS Shakti. I know that a new monthly lecture series is being begun. I'm grateful that you wanted me to be the first person to do the first talk, and I'm really hopeful that I don't disappoint you and the IAS Shakti members. However, this is a topic which is steeped in structural engineering, understanding of structural behavior, but also requires a background in architecture, a background in historical aspects. So I hope this talk today, particularly around earthquake safety of historical and heritage structures, gives you some insight and an opportunity for more people to work in this area, because we really need more engineers to be involved in this subject because of the sheer number of this sort of infrastructure, this sort of property, cultural heritage property that world over you see, but in a country like India, it's much more, it's significantly more in terms of the built infrastructure. So with that, let me begin the talk. I have chosen the topic to be challenges in seismic risk assessment and retrofit in historical and heritage structures. It's a topic that raises potential questions and possible directions, tries to present the complexities in a field of this nature, where a standard approach that we adopt for new constructions, new designs, is possibly the wrong way to go. And we can learn from what we do for new constructions, but essentially we need to adopt different approach, a very different approach when we deal with historical and heritage structures. So the presentation is divided into the following parts. I begin with an overview of earthquakes and built heritage, then look at criteria for structural interventions in historical and heritage structures. And then I basically go to the core of this presentation today, which is on defining appropriate seismic demand and acceptable performance level when you're dealing with such constructions. The challenges in estimating system capacity. Mittalji was earlier talking about the estimation of the mechanical characteristics of these materials, which is of historical constructions, which is not that straightforward. There are challenges. Acceptable structural interventions, what would basically be an acceptable structural intervention, and then move on to some concluding remarks. And I'm really looking forward to the sort of discussion that we can have after this presentation. So to begin with, if you're looking at built heritage, cultural heritage, property, and earthquakes, natural disasters, but earthquakes are some of the most violent, is one of the most violent natural disaster that one can think of. India has seen its share of natural disasters and effects of natural disasters. The human tragedies there on one side, but then the silent loss of historical monuments, heritage structures is also something that occurs in each disaster, each natural disaster, each earthquake in any part of the world. Some more, some to a lesser degree, and this really comes from the concentration of historical property in different countries. So there is, as far as historical constructions and heritage structures are concerned, an augmented vulnerability to natural disasters. This is because of their age, the deterioration over time, the various things that happen to the structure in terms of expansions, in terms of change of use, and so on. The Bhuj earthquake, for example, on the 26th of January 2001, 20 years plus now, in the Kutch district alone, there were about 15,000 heritage properties registered, and the earthquake resulted in about 10,000 heritage structures that were destroyed or extensively damaged, literally lost. We have not, there's been no dearth of natural disasters after that. We've seen the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004, the Kashmir earthquake in 2005, the Sikkim earthquake in 2011, the Kedarnath floods, the Kashmir floods, the Nepal earthquake, which also affected parts of India, the Myanmar earthquake in 2016, and many more. And this is only bound to keep increasing over time. The list will increase over time. And it's something that we really have to deal with, because when it comes to cultural heritage, once we lose it, then there is very little way you can retrieve it. You can retain the memory of what is lost. The tangible memory of what is lost is lost forever. But there's one thing that we need to first remember, which is timescales of built heritage with respect to earthquakes. And this is where different parts of the world face this problem in a more severe manner. Some parts face it in a less severe manner, but it's important to identify with this timescale. And when it comes to earthquakes, historical monuments, built heritage has been around for so many hundreds of years. In some cases, it's a few hundred years. In some cases, they've been around for, if not thousands, at least a few thousand years. So the timeline of the existence of these historical monuments, and when you look at the recurrence interval of earthquakes in different parts of the world, then one starts realizing that these sites are sites that see, these historical sites are sites that see from time to time recurrence of these earthquakes and natural disasters. So some recent examples from places not too far from our country and within our country too. This is Myanmar, and in Myanmar, the zone that we are talking about is on the banks of the Irrawaddy, the largest river there, and a place called Bagan, which is an archaeological site with over 3,500 monuments. And this site, over history, because of the 11th century to 13th century constructions, in the literature, we see records of about 10,000 such constructions. But this site has seen earthquakes at regular recurrence interval. So in 1975, there was a massive earthquake. And in 2016, that is the most recent, the same site was affected by an earthquake as severe as what happened in 1975. As I said, this is not, just in places like what I just mentioned in Burma or so, but also in places In India, if you take Bhuj, for example, we know of the Allahabad earthquake in 1819 and the massive Bhuj earthquake in 2001. These were more or less comparable in the magnitude and effect itself. The Nepal earthquake, we had the 1934 great Indo-Nepal earthquake. Bihar was significantly affected. 2015 was a very similar event. Bagan, as I said, in Myanmar, 1975 and 2016. So there's this wonderful book that, with respect to cultural heritage, built heritage, one could look at. And the foreword of that book, the preface of that book, written by Sir Bernard Fielden, begins in this manner. He says, lessons must be learned continually, and we must always be aware that we live between two earthquakes. Now, when he says between two earthquakes, is that the professional, the structural engineer, the civil engineer, or the architect, the historian, is dealing with historical monuments between two natural disasters, right? It's very unlikely that the same professional in his or her professional career can deal with the monument at two of these points in time. And that's simply the different time scales of a professional, the professional career of a person versus the recurrence intervals of these earthquakes versus the timeline of the existence of the monument itself. But this is a very important opening line in a book. In fact, the book is called Between Two Earthquakes, talks about how we really need to observe, take lessons, and ensure that a similar situation, the earthquake is going to come back, but a similar situation does not, the building does not face, the built heritage does not face a similar situation when the next event comes. So this is the issue of recurrence is of much more importance as far as historical monuments are concerned. When you look at buildings which with a design life of 50 years or design life of 100 years, the likelihood of the building experiencing an important seismic event and experiencing it twice is less, the likelihood is lesser and lesser, but not so for historical monuments that have been around for quite some time. Now, talking of that, coming to the Indian context, we face the dilemma, the problem, or the conundrum of the magnitude frequency relation in a country like India. And to quote Professor Jain, S.K. Jain, in one of his landmark papers on the Indian earthquake problem, he says the Indian subcontinent faces a relatively high frequency of large earthquakes and a relatively low frequency of moderate earthquakes. Now, this has an impact because the frequency is such that within a generation, you don't see too many moderate earthquakes, but also the chances of you seeing a massive earthquake is relatively low. But then someone in your family, your ancestors, great-grandfather or grandfather possibly, must have experienced a massive earthquake. But a few generations later, the memory of the earthquake is lost. So the memory and the impact is very different when it comes to a situation like India, where the frequency of massive earthquakes is relatively large. If you look at Bhuj, 180 years is the recurrence interval of that massive earthquake. The Nepal-Bihar earthquake is also on similar lines. But if you look at how many magnitude 5 earthquakes, magnitude 5.5 earthquakes a certain territory is witnessing, to change the culture of building, we are quite badly placed. So there's a low frequency of moderate earthquakes and a large frequency, relatively large frequency of these massive earthquakes. So very often, because of the nature of the earthquake problem, we tend to be unprepared. The memory of the earthquake fades, and that is why very often we see even historical monuments are just put up the way they were, with very little interventions that can ensure that before the next earthquake, it has adequate mitigation measures built into the structure itself. I'm just referring to here to give a sense of how different our problem is compared to other regions of the world. For example, the Ring of Fire, the Pacific Ring of Fire, parts of California or New Zealand for that matter, or you take Italy or Greece, where the earthquake problem is much more present in the time scales, present in the timeline of the human lifespan. The 475-year return period global seismic hazard map is what you're looking at, and it actually reflects where we have a challenge. In this slide, you're actually looking at the updated map of the World Heritage Sites. Of course, the Bureau of Indian Standards is in the process, and today is a very important day, is in the process of looking at a new zonation map, and I'll have to make a significant change to this map. The map that you currently see is from IS 1893 Part 1 2016, showing the 4 zones, Zone 2 to Zone 4. Superposed on it are those white dots, and those white dots are nothing but the updated list of the 40 World Heritage Sites, the UNESCO World Heritage Sites that India has, of which 32 are cultural sites, meaning 32 are built heritage sites, whereas 7 of them are natural. One is mixed, where you have natural plus built heritage, and that is Kanchenjunga Natural Park, the national park, where there's some built heritage as well. But if you look at the distribution of the World Heritage Sites across the country, there is more than 50% that actually is lying in moderate to severe seismic zones. So this is a problem. This is a problem in the sense, in India, it's a problem of numbers. We do have a very significant number of, from population to issues like this, that the built heritage, the number of buildings that we have to take care of is significant, and so is cultural heritage, built heritage in our country. So this, as I said, has been recently updated because there's an addition from Andhra. We have the Ramappa temple, the Kakatiya Ramappa temple, which has been added. Is our 39th site, and the 40th site is the first Harappan city that we have, which is Dholavira, which has been added. Dholavira sitting in seismic zone 5, as you can see, and has already seen historical earthquakes in this region. So with that, moving on, the fact remains that you need to look at, I introduced the issue of timescales, I introduced the issue of the problem of certain regions not experiencing in historic memory earthquakes, but certain other regions actually seeing frequent occurrences of earthquakes, Nepal, for example. And the fact remains that if earthquakes have been in the human memory for a significant period of time and multiple times, then you will see a change in the building culture. And that's very important. So let me look at the issue of these stone constructions, Trabeate stone constructions, post and lintel constructions. And if you look at how joints are articulated, so you have monolithic stone members, stone columns and stone beams. And if you were to just look at how the joints have been articulated, and my focus is on South India, where you have mandapas all over the place. And if you were to look at how the joints are articulated in these historical constructions, you will see that they are just simply supported. There is no positive connection, and there is no interlocking at these joints at all. If any, there is some curvature there, and that is only for alignment of the stone beam on the stone column. So we don't see any articulation of joints. You don't see in the building vocabulary any seismic resistant feature. So if you look at peninsular India, and if you were to look at construction details of historical monuments, and these mandapas that I'm talking about are about 400, 500 years old, you will see no seismic resistant features at all. However, if you were to take these and then do a standard safety check, you will see that under even the design level, the IS code level earthquakes, some of these constructions based on their slenderness ratios can have, an aspect ratios, can have potential problems under earthquake action. On the other hand, if you were to look at Kathmandu Valley, if you were to look at Nepal, you can immediately see that these constructions have a conscious introduction of articulation of joints. You can see tenon and mortise joints, and you can see significant sizes. You can actually see the sizes of the interlocking that is actually happening in these locations. And sometimes they're not sufficient because you can have large excursions displacement excursions, and if you have deteriorated joints, that could be a killer. So tenon and mortise joints and the articulation, if I were to simply look at Kathmandu Valley and South India, I can see a vast difference in the way these are articulated. And that is the point that I was trying to make, which is because of the regional memory, no earthquakes in the regional memory, the building construction history is different, right? So moving on, if we're looking at other regions in India, and if I take Kangra in Himachal, or if I were to go to Ahmedabad or Gujarat, you can see that there is a vocabulary and use of elements in the structure which actually reinforce the necessity of earthquake resistance. For example, if you look at these 400, 500-year-old constructions in Ahmedabad, you can actually see that these constructions have small wooden dowels sitting across blocks, and they're wooden dowels embedded in lime mortar, and they connect all the stones together. And if you look at a collapsed tower, temple tower, the mosque tower in the Bhuj earthquake, you could see these connecting dowels, and you could see that these connecting dowels over time have disappeared because it's wood, it's an organic material, and the lime has also been eaten away. And so you have just dry packing of stones and nothing to hold them together and give them the necessary elasticity, which these brittle systems typically don't have, stone construction systems don't have. So you can see how regionally there are features that tell you that these constructions have imbibed seismic resistant features over time. And that's something that one should, while documenting, these are some nuances while documenting such historical constructions and thinking about retrofitting them, thinking about repairing them and retrofitting them after an earthquake. Be conscious that building is aware of these interventions that can help improve its earthquake resistance. Another example here is from Kangra, and if you were to go to Kangra Fort, which was very badly damaged after the 1905 Kangra earthquake, you can actually see everywhere there are metal dowels, iron dowels that hold blocks together, and that gives the necessary capacity to keep these blocks from just completely displacing from each other. So, as I said, if I were to look at with the same lens, if I were to look at constructions in South India and do an analysis and then say no capacity at all under lateral action, and what you can actually see here is using rigid body limit analysis, a lateral load analysis is done on these radiate constructions or post-lintel constructions, and you can see if from such analysis, which basically depend on geometry and assume that the material is rigid for all practical purposes, the stone itself is not deformable. It's the joints which are really going to be opening and closing. If one were to do mechanism analysis and understand the lateral loads or accelerations at which you can get mechanism formation in such constructions, it's interesting to note that if I were to map the BIS, the levels of the earthquake demand prescribed by BIS, and look at such constructions, even for the design basis earthquake, you could have a problem in such constructions. In the sense, under the design basis earthquake for Tamil Nadu, which is zone 3 partly, so the design basis earthquake will give you a 0 period acceleration of 0.08 G. You can actually have a problem, and that's what you can see, that the factors of safety for the design basis earthquake start touching 1 and start going below 1. But then one has to think here that well, that's the design basis earthquake. For about 500 years, these regions have not had earthquakes, and so you don't have any earthquake resistant feature built into these systems, which then starts giving you a direction to think whether interventions will be required, And if so, what type of interventions? I'm just introducing the problem here. So there are no positive connections between posts and lintels in the South Indian mandapams, and they're actually vulnerable to overturning if you were to look at earthquake shaking. But in the last 500 years, there's been no instance of a severe shaking that has caused this sort of a damage. So of course, when you're studying such systems, you have to understand that there is frictional resistance between these units, and that depends on pre-compression. And these nuances are important because any lateral resistance, the system as is in its existing condition is depending on that frictional resistance for its lateral resistance. Moving on, India then has a large number of traditional constructions which are actually seismic resistant constructions. India, if you look at the Indian subcontinent, it's part of this Alpine Himalayan belt. There's a belt that runs all the way from the Alps, which is high seismic regions, to the Himalayan region through Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, and the Himalayas, goes all the way to Myanmar. This entire belt has developed local seismic cultures. This is a phrase that is used quite often, called the LSCs, or the local seismic cultures. And in all these locations, you can actually see that there are constructions which have developed vernacular over time with the knowledge of what happens to buildings in these regions. The Dhajji Diwari in Kashmir Valley is one example, in Pakistan and in India. The Tak constructions, which are sort of isolation at different floors with timber in a brick masonry with mud mortar type of construction. You have the Kathkuni construction in Himachal. You have the Ekra constructions in Assam and Sikkim, or the Assam type construction. And you have the poles in Gujarat and Ahmedabad and other regions. So there are regions where seismic resistant local construction typologies have actually been developed and seen for 100 or more years. It's interesting, if you were to examine the pole in Ahmedabad, for example, which developed organically over time over the last 200, 300 years, you can see that these constructions, you can't immediately make out whether seismic resistant features have been deliberately built in, or they are present not to a full extent, and can give you an indication that they are possibly there to assist the system in necessary earthquake resistance. So if you look at these constructions today, if you go to Ahmedabad and you look at some of these constructions, you have additions in these constructions and repairs that are happening that really do not account for how these systems respond. For example, this addition of a reinforced concrete floor on top of such constructions, or replacement and removal of wood that is really decayed and damaged, and not putting it back. Removal and not replacement is a problem, because these systems actually depend on the ductility to the system that the wooden, the timber part of the structural system really provides. There are lots of studies that have been done on architectural documentation of such constructions, and you don't see a very strong pattern of earthquake resistant features, but there are definitely good parameters, there are good design parameters, conceptualization parameters, which improve the earthquake performance of such constructions. So what I'm trying to say is that there are several regions in India where such constructions are present. And when we look at assessing their capacity, when we look at understanding if they require retrofit, it's important to look at their construction details and the history of their construction. And this is an important challenge today, because maintenance of such constructions is difficult. Over time, timber not being available or being too expensive is leading to no replacement of the damaged timber portions, introduction of reinforced concrete, and development of systems that are really unsafe for this typology. And because of which recent earthquakes in Nepal, in Sikkim, showed behavior of these constructions which were quite bad, quite detrimental, and they seem to get tagged that these are unsafe historical constructions that are unsafe. But we forget that over time, the changes that these undergo, the type of interventions that these undergo are also responsible. The modern interventions that these undergo in an insensitive manner sometimes are responsible for the poor behavior of such construction. So this is totally a different problem that we sort of need to deal with. So with that opening of the problem itself, let me just move on to what could be defined as the criteria for interventions. Structural interventions is what we're talking about. What could be the criteria for structural interventions in historical monuments and heritage structures? There are statutory provisions, there are conservation documents available world over, and with reference to India, one would want to look at these are broad policy documents. The National Conservation Policy reference is to monuments of national importance. There is a need for these to be scientifically assessed and retrofitted, and disaster management plans have to be developed in each of these sites. We also have the NDMA guidelines now, which talk of how to deal with disasters in cultural heritage sites and precincts. And there are guidelines for museums because there are contents in a museum which have to be protected when there is a natural disaster. So when you look at these constructions, when you look at this typology of construction, historical monuments and heritage structures, there are policy documents in India. We've still not moved towards guideline documents that can really make the work at the ground level significantly different from what it is today. I make reference to this committee. It's called the International Scientific Committee on Analysis, Conservation and Structural Restoration of Structures of Architectural Heritage for Architectural Heritage, and it is a scientific committee of a body called ICOMOS, International Council on Monuments and Sites, which is an advisory body to UNESCO. Now, this organization, it makes it clear there are guideline documents. There is a dialogue between different engineers and archaeologists and architects and art historians who deal with built heritage and monuments, and make it very clear that a combination of both scientific and cultural insight is indispensable in dealing with these constructions. Engineers require the cultural insight or sensitivity for the cultural insight. The architects, archaeologists need to also look at the scientific basis for structural interventions and why certain interventions may be required and so on. They identify the different expertises as feeders to the decision-making process of what needs to be done when you're carrying on structural interventions in historical monuments. And in fact, it is interesting that this scientific committee really came up to bridge the gap between structural engineers and architects and archaeologists. It identifies this area as an interdisciplinary area which requires an interdisciplinary approach, and structural engineering can actually provide the scientific support necessary to ensure safeguard of the building as a whole. And when we say safeguard, we're really talking of ensuring life safety, but with the lowest possible consequence on the identified heritage values. So this is what is fundamental, that there are heritage values for which the built heritage is known for, stands for. Those need to be protected, but in the process of safeguarding the building, in the process of ensuring life safety, in the process of ensuring that the building is not lost, we must be very careful that these identified heritage values are not tampered with, are not lost in the process of the protection. And this is what you can go to the website of ISCARSA and see the guideline recommendations that are there for the analysis, conservation, structural analysis, and structural restoration of architectural heritage. So with that premise, when we look at built heritage, it's important to understand what could be the criteria for interventions, be it diagnostic interventions, you're testing materials, you're taking out materials to a laboratory, and also deciding what the structural interventions are going to be. So it's important to be able to define the criteria for interventions, and where you begin with is understand the character defining elements of the built heritage. Why is that construction so historically important? The character defining tangible and intangible, physically evident, and there are definitely aspects that are not physically evident. but those are the character defining elements of the built heritage. These must be understood by all professionals engaged. For example, it might be that if you were to look at one of the earliest constructions where burnt clay brick is used, that is an advancement in the technology of burnt clay brick, and it's historically an important evidence in the evolution of mankind. So the use of burnt clay brick as a technique of construction becomes a character defining element. Or take, for example, the Scherzer span in the bridges that have been built across the seas. The Scherzer span then opens up, and you have the Pamban Bridge, for example, which has a Scherzer span, and that opens up. About 100 years ago, that was an advancement of engineering, and that is the tangible character defining property of that built heritage. So these things must be understood by all professionals involved in such constructions. Whenever you're engaging with such constructions, you need to recognize that codes and conventional approaches may have limitations, because typically these are developed keeping modern constructions in mind, new constructions in mind, and there can be limitations if you try to apply this to historical constructions, because they don't fit in the gambit of the type of design approach that we adopt today for different typologies of construction like reinforced concrete and steel constructions. The process of approach to conservation should be through diagnosis. You must diagnose what the problem is. Of course, if you're looking at the earthquake problem, then that's a very specific problem, but you can have multiple structural problems. Diagnosis must be the basis of any therapy, and therapy should really try to address the root cause. If you have a headache, if you go to a doctor, the doctor may give you an aspirin. The aspirin is directly taking care of the headache, but the root cause of the headache may be something different. That needs to be addressed, and therefore any diagnosis that you do should understand what therapy to choose, and that therapy should address the root cause of the distress itself. Structural performance verification is essential. Before intervention, what is the situation? And after intervention, where can you take the structure to? Must be demonstrated. But we must be careful that it can't be only quantitative. You need a combination of qualitative and quantitative understanding. Depending solely on quantitatives is a problem because of the possible uncertainties in the structural system that you don't know about, the materials, variability, and so on. So structural performance verification, both quantitatively and qualitatively, is something that is essential in such situations. And interventions must be minimal such that you help the structure respond in the way it should, but not drastically change its character and affect the heritage values that it actually stands for. You need to strike a balance between structural safety, protection of the values, and respect for the structure's authenticity. I always give this example. If you have a damaged arch above which there is a load, maybe a wall that is supported by the arch, if you think that the arch is damaged and go and embed an I section above the arch, hide it away and say that this is taking care of the heritage value, you don't want the I section to be seen, you embed it there. Structurally, it might become safe. Structurally, load path is altered and the intervention may not be visible, but the structure's authentic way of resisting loads is through arch action. Now you have short-circuited that, right? So this may be an extreme example, but calls for thinking. Is it fine? Is it okay to introduce a beam action sort of an intervention where the structure was familiar with arch action? I'll leave it there. You might want to think of what other intervention may help the structure improve the way it responds to loads. Maybe introducing a tie could be one possibility. Avoid an overcautious approach to assessment and intervention. And this is fundamentally the problem. When the uncertainty on the system is high, we tend to take an overcautious approach to assessment and intervention. When we don't know about the loads, about the way the system is responding, then we want to err on the conservative side, but we tend to err a lot on the conservative side. And that is a problem for cultural heritage because you can change the character of the building and put in interventions which can never be taken out later. we need to look at this concept of strengthening versus improving structural behavior. I'll come to that point towards the end again. And we need to demonstrate that the proposed interventions are indispensable. Without that, safety is compromised. People who engage with this building, their life safety is compromised. And two, the building itself may be lost. You need to demonstrate that that intervention is absolutely essential for the building that you're looking at. But at the same time, we have to be sensitive to cost. We have to be sensitive to environmental effects. We are living in a world where resources are scarce, more and more scarce by the day, and we have to be careful about what strategy we are choosing, even though we're talking of a very important, historically important construction. There are certain criteria which we keep in mind when dealing with interventions in such structures. Compatibility is one, that is the original materials and the original techniques versus the new repair materials and the new repair techniques. Compatibility, but compatibility can be physical compatibility, visual compatibility, chemical compatibility, and a host, mechanical compatibility. The deformability of the materials should be same, and so on. You can have a whole host of compatibility parameters between the original and the repair materials and techniques. Durability of interventions. You don't want the intervention that you're carrying out to last only for 10-15 years when the monument itself has been living for more than 1,000 years, for example. So there have been several interventions in reinforced concrete, for example, in historical masonry constructions, and people have realized that in a matter of 15 years, 10-15 years, there's so much of corrosion damage which is causing further structural distress, but the monument did not have this problem for about 200 years or 300 years or so on. So durability of the interventions is fundamental, and we should be conscious that the intervention must at least last as much as this monument. Non-invasive, as minimally invasive as possible. Non-invasive may be difficult to impose sometimes. You might have to cut, you might have to go into the cross-section, but try as much as possible to make the interventions minimally invasive. It's almost like an old human body. You don't want to go in with heavy duty interventions and surgeries. You can further damage or compromise the values of the system. The concept of removability, in about a decade ago, we used to talk about the concept of reversibility, saying if you put a certain intervention, we must be able to reverse it. In the sense, a few years later, let's say 10-15 years later, you get a better technique for structural intervention, for improvement of the structural behavior. You want to remove what you had put earlier and use the new technique. The problem is the word reversibility is contested because reversibility really cannot happen. You have changed the state of stresses by an intervention, and removing the material that you put in or the intervention that you put in and reversing the state of stresses is almost unthinkable. Therefore, today we have migrated from the word reversibility to removability as a criterion. Can you remove the intervention? It may still have some residual stresses. You can't help it, but can you remove and put something new? Or does your old intervention block any new intervention? Let us say you want to do reinforced concrete jacketing around a stone column or a stone masonry construction. There's no way you can remove it. That is an irreversible because it is not removable. That becomes the criterion. You might face a situation where after a disaster, you might have to repair certain portions. And if your intervention that you've done in the past is really blocking you from doing anything more for maintainability of the structure, then your intervention is not appropriate. Repairability of the structure post other problems is something that one must look at. And of course, on paper, some interventions look fantastic, but physically realizing them, someone has to execute it on the structure, and you're talking of monumental constructions, this can become a challenge. So one should look at feasible, physically realizable interventions, and you should be able to monitor whether the structural performance has improved or not. Put some gauges, do some health monitoring, and understand if there was tilting of a wall, has it stopped? If there was bulging of a wall, has it stopped? If there was sinking, has it stopped? You should be able to monitor the structural performance after you intervene. That is again an important criterion. So moving on, and I come to the core where, as I said, I raise questions, right? So here, what I'm really Excuse me for a second. I just wanted to exit the full screen option. I don't see part of my screen.
Hello, can you help?
Yes. No, just a second. I was just exiting from the full screen option.
You just go to top of your screen. You can view options are there.
Yeah. It's actually okay. It's actually okay. I don't see. Normally that exit full screen mode used to be there. That's not showing.
Okay, okay.
Anyway, I just wanted to go into those core questions, and as I said, I don't have solutions, but some directions. One of the fundamental things is about when we look at earthquake safety of these constructions. One of the key problems is what is the level of earthquake input that we must work with, right? So one of the fundamental problems is we have to depend on codes, because some engineer has to actually state that, yes, I have checked against the prevalent codes and the system seems to be working fine, or it is inadequate, and someone has to give a safety certificate. So very often engineers are in the situation where they're asked to give a certificate and asked to do a safety audit. And what do you do when you look at an existing building? You approach it the way you would approach a new design, and then try to follow the same process. So you fall back on the codes and then try to look at the code for defining what is the earthquake input, the earthquake performance level, therefore what hazard level of the earthquake should you be considering for the safety assessment of this historical monument. The first and fundamental question is, are code prescribed earthquake performance levels acceptable? For example, if you have IS 1893 saying design basis earthquake and the maximum considered earthquake, are those levels that are designed there, designated there, okay for you to use for monument or historical construction safety assessment, seismic safety assessment? It's a question. Now, I want to just bring out a little bit of a contrast. If I were to look at the number of codes that talk about retrofitting, that talk about safety assessment, IS 13935 talks about safety assessment of reinforced concrete structures and other types of structures. There is a statement in IS 13935 which goes, special buildings of monumental nature, implying monumental structures or historical monuments, analyzed using seismic actions as per IS 1893 part 1, you should basically go with adopting a higher importance factor or adopt the maximum considered earthquake. When you're designing new constructions, you normally use a design basis earthquake, right? A DBE, or you use an importance factor which is 1, or if you really think that it's of a different typology where the importance factor is 1.5 applicable, you use that. But then there's this statement in IS 13935 that says, if it's a monumental building, you can increase the importance factor or use the maximum considered earthquake. Now, what is the implication of that? Your design forces are going to increase. And then you have to look at whether this is a building that actually was designed, constructed with this sort of a framework in mind. Absolutely not. You look at IS 13828, of course, that's for low strength masonry constructions. And it talks about using an importance factor of 1.5 for monumental buildings, right? And what are you doing? Normal buildings, you will take 1. Now, monumental buildings, you automatically increase the seismic loads. So if you were to do a check against seismic check for monumental buildings, you can be sure your seismic forces are increasing, and therefore your check is going to result, most probably your building will not have that sort of capacity. And then the risk is it can lead to substantial retrofitting and strengthening. You will try to upgrade the building. Now you will say it has to conform to this code. Otherwise, the engineer, will be held responsible. And so I will retrofit it, I'll strengthen it to this higher level. But it's interesting to note that today, in the last decade, I would say, there is a discussion And few international standards have started moving towards suggesting that if you're looking at a historical monument versus a new construction, we would suggest a reduced seismic input in comparison to a new construction. So where is this rationale coming from? So let me go to these two documents that actually talk about reducing the earthquake input, okay, which sounds counterproductive. You want to keep this monument forever, for thousands of years, and then you're saying reduce the earthquake input. Now, if you're looking at a larger design life, the earthquake input is also going to keep increasing. For all of you that know probabilistic seismic hazard analysis, your hazard curves only keep increasing over time. Of course, it becomes unrealistic beyond the length of the earthquake catalog that you have, but numerically it will keep increasing. So what do the Italian guidelines say? This is the document called the Guidelines for Evaluation and Mitigation of Seismic Risk to Cultural Heritage, a document produced by the Ministry for Cultural Heritage and Activities in 2007. It talks about a reachable or attainable seismic safety index. It says that you should be able to estimate a seismic safety index. And what is the seismic safety index? It is actually the ratio between the level of attainable seismic protection compatible with the necessities of the building. You're looking at a historical building with a certain function, and the desired level of protection based on its category of use and importance. So basically it's saying you want to increase the seismic safety level, to the protection level, to a certain value, but what I can attain is different. I cannot treat it like an existing normal building and increase it to as much I want, because the values of the building, the historical character of the building can get affected. So we try to, it suggests that we arrive at a seismic safety index as a ratio between the level of attainable seismic protection as is. So I look at a building, I try to estimate its capacity, and then there I try to look at how much seismic safety is available with respect to how much you expect from the code. You look at whether the seismic safety index is such that the capacity is lower than the expected demand. And then if the capacity is lesser than the seismic demand, then you think of how much you want to increase. So this is the concept of the seismic safety index, and it becomes a reference value for the evaluation of the compatibility of the planned use. You want to use it as a museum, you want to use it as a restaurant, an old building being used as a restaurant, for the operational decision, and also for the operational decisions on strengthening. So once I arrive at the seismic safety index, then if it is inadequate with respect to the input level, I can decide how much to push it up carefully, such that it does not affect the historicity, does not affect the historical values for which it actually stands. And so the seismic evaluation levels, there are different levels of evaluation that prescribes. A level one evaluation is only qualitative. A second level is where we look at, in historical masonry constructions, it is useful to look at local collapse mechanisms which do not compromise the overall structural safety, but local things like parapets falling off, or gable roofs falling off, chimneys falling off, individual walls having out of plane failure. And the third level is when you do a full global evaluation. So you do a qualitative check, do a local collapse mechanism check, and do a global check. And this becomes the basis of the capacity of the system. What is the available safety, and that versus what is desirable is what gives you the seismic safety index. So the guidelines then say that you then have to look at 3 different limit states. A first limit state is an ultimate limit state, where what you want to do is you want to ensure that the building collapse or partial collapse of the building does not compromise the people working there. Life safety has to be guaranteed. So it safeguards basically against a rare and a high intensity shaking. The second level is a damage limit state. You want to limit the effects of structural damage, the economical and functional damage, and this therefore will be a more frequent earthquake and a lower intensity earthquake shaking. Museum, you don't want the museum to just go bust and no visitors for 3 years, 10 years. Economic problems can crop up because of such situations. So you want to limit the structural damage. The third category is a limit state of damage of works of art. For example, if there are paintings, if there is bas relief sculpture on walls, you don't want that to get damaged because it's a non-structural component, it is a render. If that were to get damaged, then the cultural value is lost. Can you think of the Last Supper painting on a wall in a church in Milan? If an earthquake shaking is going to lead to that entire mural painting getting damaged, it's a non-structural damage because it could be just plaster cracks. But if you lose the whole painting, then the value of that entire building is gone. It's such a valuable site. So that's where the third limit state comes. And it's interesting. I just show you a table here just to reinforce the point that I'm trying to make. What the code says, what this guideline document says is, if we take a 10% probability of exceedance in 50 years, so a 475-year return period earthquake, for the ultimate limit state, we look at the category of use of the building, how many people access it, how long are they there, and so on. Category of use: infrequently used, frequently used, and very frequently used, versus the category of importance, limited, so low importance, medium importance, and high importance. So you have this matrix of use and importance. And if you look at, for the ultimate limit state, the reference is to the 10% probability of exceedance in 50 years. And you see that the 10% probability of exceedance is actually changed to something higher. A 40% probability of exceedance, a 25% probability of exceedance, a 17% probability of exceedance. You see that these numbers, except for, of course, the last two numbers, are different from the 10% probability of exceedance in 50 years. And the numbers in the bracket, 0.5, 0.65, 0.8, numbers that you see mean that if the code defines a certain P ground acceleration for a 10% probability of exceedance in 50 years in a given place, then if it's a culturally important building, a cultural heritage building, if it is categorized based on use and based on importance, you will reduce the earthquake input. Now that's counterproductive, counterintuitive to what the IS code is saying. Use a higher importance factor or use the maximum considered earthquake. You see, for the new code, if you're using a 10% probability of exceedance in 50 years, then the guideline is saying you take 50% of that, or you take 65% of that, or you take 80% of that. There is a reduction in the seismic input. And so with the design base, the damage limit state, the second limit state as well, you see that it talks about going 90%. The probability of exceedance increases. Probability of exceedance increases, the level of shaking decreases. So it basically implies you're reducing the earthquake input when you're assessing structures of historical importance. So this is an important deviation where very clearly there is a prescription to reduce the earthquake input, because those earthquake inputs that are defined in the code are keeping in mind new constructions. However, requirement is it should not collapse. And if partial damage is there, it should not kill people. That doesn't change. That has to be taken care of. However, these numbers show that there is an intent to reduce the earthquake input. I take the second example, and which is the New Zealand Technical Guidelines for the Seismic Assessment of Existing Buildings 2017 from New Zealand. And here they introduce a concept of a percentage compliance to the new building standard. So you have a new building standard. The earthquake code says this is the earthquake input that you use for a new construction, and you introduce a percentage NBC. What is this NBS? I'm sorry. Percentage NBS says you take the existing building and check how much percentage does it comply to, and there are ways of arriving at that quantitatively. How much does it comply with respect to the new building standard requirements? And there's a very clear statement: existing buildings need not comply to 100% of the new building standards. So here again, you see an example where the input is prescribed to be lowered for existing buildings, but also for culturally important buildings. With that thought, let me move on. Once you look at defining earthquake input, and that area needs to be further discussed and further articulated in our country, in our guidelines. We move to the second part. It is linked to the estimate of the it is linked to the seismic performance verification, and that is you have to estimate the capacity of the system, right? And as I had mentioned earlier, you could do it qualitatively, but you can't stop there. You have to go into some quantitatives. The Italian code talks about using some local mechanism analysis for parts of buildings and global analysis. So there are different options available because you'll have to deal with structural modeling and seismic analysis. But one has to be very careful. What are the underlying assumptions in the choice of certain elements, analysis approaches, and so on. So you have a whole set of possibilities here. But it's important to understand one fundamental distinction, which is the use of linear elastic analysis versus nonlinear analysis for materials which are weak in tension. And particularly when you do finite element analysis and decide to do linear elastic analysis instead of nonlinear analysis for materials like masonry, which have low tensile strength, it's problematic. If you take a symmetric construction, simply a simple multi-storied construction with openings, both directions, I mean, there is symmetry in the wall that you're seeing. But if you were to subject this to lateral forces, you have axial forces and then you have lateral forces. If you were to subject this to overturning effects of lateral force, then in a material like masonry, which has tensile strength different from compressive strength, significantly different from compressive strength, then the three piers that you see here, the left pier, the central pier, and the right pier, because of the overturning moment, effect of the overturning moment in terms of the axial load in the three piers, the states of stresses in the three piers are going to be different. Because of which you can have, if you were to consider a linear elastic analysis, where I don't differentiate between tensile strength and compressive strength, you can have a problem of the distribution of the loads, distribution of the lateral effects in the three piers. So the nonlinear analysis will be able to capture this immediately and tell you how the three piers, because of the level of axial compression being different in them, will have different shear capacity. So you see the three piers here, and you see the lateral load that is distributed to the three piers. Now, elastic analysis will tell you all three should get equal. I mean, depending on their cross section and their aspect ratios, pier 1 and pier 3 should get the same proportion of lateral force. Pier 2 should get, depending on its cross-sectional properties. But if you do a nonlinear analysis, the level of compressive stresses or tensile stresses will dictate the stiffness of that member, and the distribution of lateral force to these three will be different. Now, for a material which is weak in tension, this is something fundamental. And if you adopt linear elastic analysis, there's something completely missing in the way the model is going to respond in relation to a nonlinear analysis. So one has to keep this in mind. This difference can be captured only by nonlinear analysis unless you are conscious of this and put in checks in your results, as forces at ultimate are distributed according to the strength capacity and not the elastic stiffness. So this fundamental difference means if you're working with masonry constructions, most of our historical monuments are masonry constructions, linear elastic can be a starting point, but not the one that you want to take your critical decisions on first. Moving on, you can have the world today provides so many different opportunities and ways in which you can model. It can be from simple, robust lump mass modeling with soil structure interaction models incorporated. You can do a lump mass finite element model of these systems. You could do a three-dimensional finite element model, basically using continuum finite element model. It could be a planar model. It could be a solid model of the entire construction. So you have all these opportunities. One has to be very clear about the appropriateness of a certain continuum modeling approach with respect to a certain typology of masonry and the capabilities of the elements that one is using in this context. You could use discontinuum modeling. We saw continuum finite element modeling. Discontinuum modeling is very appropriate when you look at blocky stone constructions with no mortar, so stone on stone dry stack constructions. You want to use discontinuum models for this. Sometimes this can be further integrated. You could use nonlinear finite elements with interface. So nonlinear finite element with interface modeling, or go for discontinuum modeling, where you're able to represent the different parts of this masonry. So this is another opportunity that you could have in terms of the modeling. Masonry constructions, as I said, masonry constructions can be modeled in different ways. We saw continuum finite element modeling type of approaches, but you could also do component modeling, structural component modeling, and using what is called equivalent frame modeling approach is something else that is adopted for rather regular masonry constructions. If you don't have a dome and if you don't have arches, this sort of a construction, this sort of a modeling approach called the equivalent frame modeling is something that is adopted, where you designate the piers and the spandrels as frame elements and give them hysteretic rules, shear and flexural hysteretic rules, and this can be assembled to represent the overall three-dimensional geometry. But as I said, when you are dealing with masonry constructions, and especially historical masonry constructions, there will be parts of the building that will respond not in a global manner, but more in an independent manner, and therefore you need to do local checks. A parapet might fall off, or a gable wall might fall off much before the building can actually show significant damage due to an earthquake. So local mechanism analysis is essential for seismic verification. Here we are really looking at loss of stability because of equilibrium issues rather than exceedance of the material strength. So rigid body analysis is something that is adopted here, and kinematic limit analysis based on principles of virtual work can be used to estimate at what level of horizontal acceleration can a mechanism form, which is the capacity of that member, of that portion of the structure. So you can see a part of a structure might detach and tend to fall off rather than the entire structure showing shear damage, for example, as you see in the right figure. So a global mechanism would mean X cracks and so on, but detachment of a wall would be a local mechanism, and that local mechanism might not be captured by a global analysis. You might need to do simpler limit analysis based approaches to be able to capture the capacity of the system there. So you can work on rigid body analysis. Basically, you're trying to find out at what overturning force is a mechanism formed and what is the resisting force available in the system itself. Just to give you some examples of certain nuances which one has to look at, because as I said earlier, insight into these constructions, the typology of construction, the material, the history of construction, the construction methods used is extremely important in modeling and understanding the behavior of such constructions. This is an example of a historical construction from Myanmar, and the structure has magnificent paintings inside in one floor, but the structure has actually undergone a lot of structural damage. This is in Bagan, so 1975 earthquake versus 2016 earthquake. In both the earthquakes, it has got damaged, and there are interventions that were carried out in the structure after the 1975 earthquake. And so how do you handle them in the new analysis is an important thing. In the 2016 earthquake, upper portions of the structure got damaged. In the 1975 earthquake, the lower portions of the structure were severely damaged, but interventions were carried out. If you can see a band here, there's a reinforced concrete band that was introduced in the 1990s as a structural retrofit intervention in the past. But that was not carried out in all the floors. And so upper floors got damaged and the lower floors survived in the current earthquake. So if you were to look at modeling and analysis of this sort of a construction, it's important to know the structural typology, the construction techniques used in the past here. And we found very interesting way in which the arches were constructed and the vaults were constructed very different from the true arch mechanism. So we are familiar with corbelling as a technique for arch construction versus the true arch construction. And here we encountered a system where there is a combination of corbelling and true arch construction. Now this nuance, one had to understand this nuance and also reflect that in the numerical modeling. So what you can see here is how the numerical model is trying to reflect this difference in the structural cross section. This needs to be examined whether it has a role to play in the structural safety or not. Again, when you do this, as I was mentioning, the difference in the way the vaulting is done, part of it is corbelled and it is finished off with true arch construction. Now, how do you deal with it? These are two different systems, and if your numerical model, if you're aware of this, you can try to make a numerical model reflect that and see if the construction technique has an effect, and is there a way of addressing it in your analysis itself. Yeah, and in a couple of minutes, I think I'll try and close the.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So as I was mentioning, it is important to be able to reflect the existing condition of this sort of a structure. And if you see these constructions, as I said, the structure was affected in the 1975 earthquake. Reinforced concrete bands were introduced, and these reinforced concrete bands are sitting there, not at all the levels, but at the lower level alone. So it was important to model it to see if the 2016 earthquake damage could be replicated, and understand what should we be doing today to improve the earthquake capacity of this sort of a construction. So the original construction with the reinforced concrete band and potential interventions with the new interventions that one wants to introduce, being conscious of the fact that we must choose compatible interventions. So one can try different techniques of interventions here and then look at whether the structural performance verification is feasible. Just to close, a way in which the analysis approach, the seismic verification approach, could proceed for masonry constructions, historical masonry constructions, is there are several weak links in historical masonry constructions, and it is important to identify them because the capacity of the system is going to be limited by the weakness of the structural members and the structural systems. So an approach quite similar on the lines of what the New Zealand code actually proposes is the weak link identification approach, where you're going from collecting as much information. You don't have drawings, you probably have to make those drawings, estimate the seismic demand, and the level of seismic protection that we were talking about earlier needs to be established. You can do an initial seismic assessment, which is more qualitative than quantitative, but you could also make it quantitative for local mechanism analysis, and then see if other code compliance checks are seen in the structure or not. Now, this initial seismic assessment would then be followed by material characterization, and this sort of material characterization can come from existing literature, or you may want to carry out these tests, or you could do a comprehensive test in the structure and get these get this data that you require for the modeling. Once you do the initial seismic assessment, if the structure does not comply to those minimum requirements of the mechanism checks that you're doing, you would have to actually go and look at a level 1 seismic strengthening. Are connections working? Do you need to introduce a continuous band? Do you need some out-of-plane wall strengthening because you want to prevent out-of-plane failure mechanisms, and so on? Once that is done, you really need to check if the out-of-plane piers, out-of-plane walls have their capacity. If they don't have, then you're basically going back to level 1 seismic strengthening and ensuring that the out-of-plane strengthening is provided. Then check diaphragms. If diaphragms are flexible, you might have to look at level 1 strengthening again. If diaphragms are semi-rigid and rigid, and if they survive the check, then you might want to go to the next stage, which is trying to understand the other structural elements, the spandrels, the piers, and make the checks. There are situations where there'll be interactions between these piers and spandrels, and that's you can check. Now, at each level, what you're trying to see is the weakest link is being identified and eliminated. You don't want the system to have portions where such failures are actually happening, and therefore if a certain failure happens, then the capacity of the system is limited by that weak link. You are identifying that weak link and then trying to create an intervention that will take care of it. Now the system will be able to withstand a higher level of earthquake shaking, and so systematically you proceed till you reach the global capacity of the system. So the global mechanism is an in-plane mechanism, and you will check demand to capacity ratio there and see if any further strengthening is required. So that's how earlier the level 1 strengthening was done, and now you will come to a level 2 strengthening to ensure that the system is capable of resisting the earthquake shaking, that the global response is adequate, is checked. Let me come to the last part, which is about interventions. And I'll take a couple of minutes just to wrap this up. I won't be going too much into detail, but the issue is, historically, the last 200-300 years, we've seen how heavy engineering interventions have been carried out in the with the intent of saving the monument. A classical example is how stiff concrete abutments, what you see here are concrete abutments that have been put in place in the Colosseum, which is one of the oldest monuments that you can see in Europe. Today, it's all frozen. The cracks are all filled up, and you've got epoxy filled up in those cracks, and you have this heavy abutment that is a concrete abutment. Of course, the structure is safe, but one would have to be taught that the abutment does not belong to the original construction. It is a later addition. So there is an interference with the historicity that is happening here. Another example, and this is from Bagan in 2016, what you can see is a historical monument constructed in the 11th century, between 11th and 13th century. After the 2016 earthquake, the ring beam at the spire, a heavy reinforced concrete ring beam of the spire, led to collapse of the spire, and the entire ring beam along with the spire all coming down. Rest of the structure was intact. So the interventions carried out in these constructions, how compatible are they? How much do they respect the historicity of these constructions is important. And therefore, I will talk about this point, which is we have to examine, do we want to seismically upgrade a historical monument or improve its performance? So seismic upgrading means execution of work that gives a building greater seismic safety with a seismic protection level that is comparable and required for new constructions, whereas seismic improvement means you're not trying to make it comparable to a new construction. The seismic protection level may be still inferior to that required for new constructions, but the building will finally have greater seismic safety. Okay, so one has to distinguish when you're looking at historical monuments between upgrading and improving. Seismic improvement is the way forward, not seismic upgrading. There are, I close with a few examples, interventions such as providing ties and ensuring integration of all the structural members in the system, the walls with the floor system, tying between walls and floor systems and roof systems is a very useful intervention of seismic improvement of the system. You allow the system to function as one, which is fundamental to the earthquake resistance of a masonry construction. Tying of the wall can be done in very nuanced manners, but adequate enough for the kind of demands that it can see. You can see very small ties that strong enough to keep these walls together. They could even be seen outside as interventions carried out for seismic improvement. It's also important that we work not only at the system level, but also at the material level. Sometimes you might have to grout and improve the quality of the masonry, introduce elements such as through stones. Sometimes these through stones can be in concrete if you're not able to find stone. Put these through stones such that the wall remains one integral piece, and then introduce, for example, if you look at the intervention prescribed in IS 4326 is about wooden seismic band such that the walls actually work with each other. So you need to think of member system level integrated with component level and material level interventions when you're conceiving the overall interventions in such constructions. Sometimes something as simple as a temporary intervention, not temporary, it is something that is removable. For example, providing confinement to masonry towers. So if you provide confinement, you're working against Poisson's effect. And if you're working against Poisson's effect, you're automatically increasing the compressive strength of the material. So such interventions can be executed in several ways. One of the ways is to do jacketing. You can do jacketing with concrete, you can do jacketing with fiber reinforced plastics, you can introduce confinement effects, but you could also do it in a reversible manner, respecting the authenticity, historicity of the material. This could be a fundamental difference in the material and the way you approach historical monuments for improving the performance, structural performance of this sort of a material. To conclude, this is a very vast area, and today we have a large number of people working here, but engineers are still few, and really there's a lot of room for engineers to work in this field of heritage conservation. But you require knowledge on traditional building materials and techniques, which often we don't teach in our undergraduate and postgraduate programs, but you can always pick up that, because this is important from maintenance, repair, but also the relevance of these techniques today from sustainable, eco-friendly ways in which our ancestors constructed. Risk assessment is another area of built heritage where engineers have to come in. To natural disasters, to man-made disasters, do risk assessment, do vulnerability analysis. Impacts on the values have to be identified simultaneously. Structural assessment, safety assessment, design, detail, develop alternatives. Understand that there can be multiple interventions and choose these interventions on how minimalistic they are in terms of the impact on the values. You but need to know that this is an area where you work with archaeologists, you work with architects, art conservators, and try to find interventions that are most compatible and least negative in its impact on the values. And the ingredients for this sort of specialization are an attitude and an aptitude to think from first principles, beyond codes, deep unbiased respect for our history, open-mindedness to see and respect multiple perspectives, and necessary sensitivity to heritage conservation, which we can ingrain in undergraduate education. Working in the area of disasters, we have to remember that we are somewhere in this cycle all the time. An earthquake has happened, we are in the immediate response phase, but after a few years, when mitigation should start and preparation for the next event should start, then our energies tend to go down. But we have to remember that this is cyclic and the next earthquake is around the corner. I would leave you with a set of reading material that can help clear your fundamentals and develop a certain thinking in this direction. The book by Sir Bernard Fielden, Between Two Earthquakes, is a fantastic read. This recent book on historic construction and conservation, material systems and damage by Pere Roca, Paolo Lorenzo is another book. A recent book by Damien Grant and Edmund Booth on earthquake design practice for buildings gives you an overview of how you deal with different types of constructions, including historical. And finally, a recent book, which is a picture book of structural performance, where historical constructions damaged in New Zealand in the Canterbury earthquake in 2011 have been strengthened. And that's a picture book that collects different approaches in a high seismic zone. Thank you. I have taken more time than allotted to me. And sorry for the initial glitch. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Professor Arun. That was really a wonderful lecture. So personally, I have drawn a lot of insights, because the research team at our place also works in this area, that is assessment and retrofitting, but of more simple structures, that is RC and masonry buildings. But your lecture has once again proved that it is a collaborative effort, not a single standalone structural engineer or architect or historian or like expert in culture. So really wonderful, and I thank you. And it seems that there are several questions in the chat window. So first I'll go through these questions, and after that I request participants to raise their hand, and we'll give you option to ask the question directly. Okay, so first question is by Professor Mainak Ghoshal. That is, could you cite the difference between cultural, natural, and built heritage? Yeah, Arun.
Yeah, so we broadly say cultural heritage, but then cultural heritage can be classified as natural heritage and built heritage. Now, why natural heritage becomes part of cultural heritage is because there may be let's take Kanchenjunga, for example. The mountain is revered as a god. So that becomes part of the natural heritage of that area, part of the cultural heritage, but it's part of the nature. So that's an example of a natural heritage, area of natural heritage. It could also be a biopark, it could also be something of that nature, but here I'm talking of cultural heritage. So the mountain itself is revered. So it becomes part of the natural heritage. But then if you have constructions, man-made constructions, human-made constructions, that's built heritage. So that's the fundamental difference between natural and built heritage.
Yeah. Thank you, Arun. Yeah, one more, maybe it's not a question, by Professor Maina Ghoshal, that is, northern Bihar is very vulnerable to earthquakes, and the 1934 earthquake destroyed almost the entire city. It seems World Heritage sites are nil for eastern region of India, but Nargona Palace in Darbhanga was the first earthquake-resistant building in India. So maybe it's from Wikipedia. So it withstood 1988 earthquake. Maybe it's information. Okay, let me go to the next question. Piyush Sharma, they are not only for collapse prevention. Maybe this question is not full. We'll give a chance to ask this question directly. And then another question by Pradosh, that is, can one use ASC 41 code for seismic evaluation and retrofit of existing buildings?
Yes. So I did not mention ASC 41, but ASC 41 is not developed keeping structures of historical importance in mind. It's more about existing buildings. So you might see that element missing about the cultural value, historical value of buildings missing. However, ASC 41 is a well thought through code for existing building evaluation. Definitely, it falls into the purview of the codes, but I didn't deliberately talk about ASC 41 because of the shorter span of historical buildings in the US, for example. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Arun. And the next question is by Ratna Kishore. It seems these SLUs are nothing but BSE 1E, BSE 2E level earthquakes as per ASC 41. So maybe
yes, which is true. And if you actually were to compare these numbers, you can see that they're not going to be very different. Maybe there's a finer definition in terms of the exceedance probabilities, rather than for the Eurocodes, for example, they work with a 10% probability of exceedance and a 2% probability of exceedance. And then in this guideline document, they're breaking it down further based on importance category and use, which is basically looking at a wider number of probabilities of exceedance. So, and it's a good thing that codes converge. The language may be slightly different, and you will see a lot of convergence in the British standards and the different guideline documents on the subject. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So the next question is by Dr. Kunal. That is, limit state of damage to the work of art sound very interesting to me. I presume one will need a benchmark reference for the damage to a work of art for identifying when this limit state is reached. So if that is the case with this limit state, I am curious to know how physical damage to a work of art is related to its highly subjective art value. So if you could explain a bit more.
Yeah. So two very quick things. As far as the limit state of damage to works of art, the guideline document, the Italian guideline document is very smart. They don't prescribe those numbers, okay? Because it's highly variable. It's highly variable. But the benchmark there is, if the work of art, and when we say work of art, it is not necessarily a museum piece as contained inside a building. That can be treated separately as a movable heritage. But here we are talking of something that is on a structural member, on like a bas relief carved onto the wall, or a painting on a wall, mural painting on a wall. When you have such situations, if there is structural damage and non-structural damage like cracks in plaster precede structural damage or amplify structural damage, then the chances are you will lose the work of art. So the criteria that they say is, if the work of art is repairable, such that its value is not lost, it is acceptable as a repair that you can carry out. So a level of shaking at which the work of art is either not damaged or damaged only up to a level where the repairs do not spoil the value of the art. If the repairs spoil the value of the art, or if the mural completely falls off as the plaster falls off, then there is a problem. You have exceeded that limit state. So there are broad guidelines on how this can be defined, but from building to building, typology to typology, this can vary, and hence hard numbers have not been prescribed even in the guideline document.
Yeah, thank you, Arun. And another question is by Riddesh. That is, what are the courses that one needs to take after his or her master's in structural engineering to carry out this audit and recovery?
That's a very interesting question, because in India we still don't have a regulatory regime where it says that you have to have a certain training or a certification before you work on historically important buildings or heritage structures. You just need to be a licensed structural engineer. It is not even mandated anywhere that a conservation architect only should work on a historical building. So the regulatory frameworks in India are still not properly defined in this context. If you take Europe, for example, or even if you take the US and other countries around the world, there is a prescription in terms of what you should have completed in terms of your training and certification before you can design, intervene, sign interventions in such constructions. So in India, currently, regulatory framework doesn't exist, but there are courses that are offered by architecture schools, conservation architecture schools, open to engineers. Some of these are short-term training programs over a year, spread over a year. INTAC Delhi, for example, International Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage Delhi, runs a postgraduate diploma course spread over a year. It's open to engineers. It's for sensitization on heritage approach. There are other schools of architecture which have started master's programs where they are open to engineers joining them. So you could do that. You could do that as part of your training, but nothing is mandated still in the country. So we don't have a regulatory framework yet on this subject.
Yep, thanks, Arun. The last one, this is from the chat window. This is something, a personal kind of question. So, like, are you supervising PhD students? And if someone want to get your guidance, what they should do? So maybe you can directly answer that.
Yes. No, there are, and it's very heartwarming to see engineers wanting to work on these subjects. And one thing you should understand, a PhD is a training. Okay, the topic is incidental. And so, you can be wedded to the topic. You can like the topic and take it up as your career. But PhD is actually a training. So once you look at it that way, you'll have more people working in this area, and that's actually what is happening at IIT Madras, for example. I've had civil engineers, MTech structure students completed their structures, MTech in structural engineering, who have taken up their PhD. So it's the regular PhD program at IIT Madras, but their focus is on looking at appropriate constitutive modeling or model structural elements that capture certain things that other elements might not be able to capture, look at dry stack constructions and understand how their structural safety can be established experimentally and numerically. So yes, I've had a handful of PhD students who worked on this subject, and I do see at other IITs and other NITs as well that this topic is opening up, and there are people working in this subject.
Yeah, thank you, Arun. Now, if anyone wants to ask a question directly, you can raise hand, and we can open, like we can give that facility. Anyone? Maybe last one or two. Yeah. So yeah. So this Poloju Narasimhachari. Yeah. Srikanth, can you give that option so they can ask?
Yeah. Good evening, Arun Madam and Ramanchalla and Manoj Mittal, as well as Vishakshi Madam. It's a very nice presentation, and it's a very rare, and as well as I can say that historical consideration for the seismic parameters which you explained is very well. Just only a small question I can your comment is in the just historical and arch-wise consideration structures which are given. There is a one sort of a recent FEMA code 2091 is specifically addressing not only the monument heritage structures, as existing structures can also be not to consider the non-linear analysis for the consideration, which are already exist elaborated in the ASC 7 2016 19 chapter, as well as the ASC ACI 4117 also. It is addressing the consideration of the non-linear, but as a latest FEMA 2091, it is specifically says that up to 12 stories of height of the either whatever it may be, if it is a monument structure, heritage structure, the non-linear analysis has not supposed to be carried out. It's latestly it is given. Please comment on that.
I am not familiar with this myself, so I wouldn't comment on something that I'm not sure about. But one has to look at what typology of building is being referred to. I'm not sure what typology of building is being. Is it engineered constructions or is it non-engineered constructions? If it's a non-engineered construction, sorry,
it is an engineering construction only. It is a museum. It's an old museum in UK. So at the point of time, he was explaining the same sort of a monument which you have shown just now. Similar type of structure which he was explaining. So he was specifically addressing not to consider the non-linear analysis for the particular structure. It's
okay.
Completely not regular structure. It's an old museum only, 18th century museum. But specifically he was addressed as a 40 to 50 years old structures. You are not supposed to carry out the non-linear analysis.
I think
consideration of the safety consideration or else whatever it may be, but
yeah,
even it is addressed in the AC 7 2016 19 chapter, as well as 4117 8 chapter. Also it is given, you can do a non-linear analysis. Whereas
so I think it is only a word of caution by the code.
Yes.
So the point is, if you want to adopt nonlinear analysis for constructions on which knowledge on the sequence of construction, actual structural system, the strength of the materials in construction is uncertain, when the uncertainties are large, the prescription is that you don't use nonlinear analysis because it is a refined method of analysis. So it is just a good practice that if the level of information is coarse, then approach analysis using simpler techniques. If the techniques, if the information you have on the structure is vast and reliable and of less certainty, less uncertainty, then you can go for finer and finer techniques of analysis. It comes from that point of view. So the Italian code, for example, the Eurocodes also talk of a knowledge factor. So if the building that you are studying, assessing, the knowledge on the material, the structural system, the sequence of construction is limited, it does not allow you to do nonlinear analysis. It asks you to do only linear elastic analysis with all the limitations of the assessment. But if you want to go from linear elastic analysis to nonlinear analysis or nonlinear time history analysis or something, then it tells you your only option is to get more information on the structure. So you have to do more tests, you have to spend more time on the structure, make drawings, verify things, if that information is available. So lesser the uncertainty, more the access to refined, rigorous types of analysis is. Vice versa is also valid.
Yep. Thank you, Arun. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Charlie. Now the last question, this is like, where can we find the structural details of temples, particularly like 1,000 years old in Tamil Nadu? So any data?
Tough question. Tough question. One, I mean, if you are an engineer or an architect, you can go visit the structure and try to understand what the structural system is. Ready-made answer in any book, I'm very difficult to find. It may be there. You have to look at some archaeology books. You have to look at some history books, history of construction books. But documentation of structural systems is very rare. There is architectural documentation, archaeological documentation, but systematic documentation of structural systems and materials is rare. And so I would suggest you visit the site and do that firsthand and then make that the first document.
Okay. Thank you, Arun. That was a really wonderful talk. And then you can see the kind of interest which participants had, several questions, and you have addressed all of them. So I thank you on behalf of ISTT, so especially South India, and also on behalf of IIIT Hyderabad. And yeah, before I close, I request Manoj Mittal sir, if you are, can give some closing remarks before we close.
Yeah,
Yes.
it was really very interesting and very informative presentation, and I really enjoyed this. I was sitting throughout the lecture and I listened each and every word, and I could relate some of the things, because sometime back, around 10 years back or something, we did some structures and we used some of the techniques which you mentioned here, and really it is a very intricate and very demanding field. Actually, you need to have knowledge of several areas and you need to work in a team, and really it is a very challenging and satisfying field actually. So I think it was a very good presentation lecture. And Dr. Pradeep, I will request you to, can we upload this lecture on YouTube channel so that everybody can see it, listen to it later on also?
Yes, I'll just write an email and take his consent.
Yeah, we will give the link of this lecture to all our members, because those who have not attended, they can also go through this lecture. I think it is a very wonderful lecture. I think you should again invite Professor Arun Menon to talk about in this field further into more detail actually. And rather we will plan something more actually. Yeah. Very nice.
So thank you. So nothing better than this as a good start of a monthly lecture series. So yeah. So historical structures.
Thank you so much.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you everyone who participated in this lecture. So thank you, and maybe see you in the next month with another good lecture on structural engineering. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.